So welcome to the Russell and Copleston radio debate, and this is a series of lessons which effectively help you annotate your anthology guides, and for your Edexcel A-level religion, philosophy and ethics exam, you need to be able to understand fully the debate that took place between Russell and Copleston. So it's really important at the very beginning you have read the anthology extract to get your head around some of the language that's complex and some of the ideas that will be very obvious as you read it. You'll find as you look at this particular radio debate that actually you will be very familiar with some of the concepts, and so you'll end up revising by default things from your AS Year 12 content like cosmological argument, principle of sufficient reason, fallacy of composition. You'll revisit things like religious experience, the design argument, the ontological argument, the use of analytic and synthetic arguments. A bit of the problem of evil even arises in this radio debate, and a couple of A2 concepts as well. And so you'll find it very useful to draw from prior knowledge that you already have. And so we have a look, first and foremost, at the two people involved in the debate. The first is Frederick Copleston, very interestingly, a Jesuit Roman Catholic priest, a philosopher and a historian. What's interesting about Copleston is that he wasn't particularly famous. He didn't develop his own philosophical ideas. He wrote a big book called The History of Philosophy, but he was more famous later because of his debate, this very debate with Bertrand Russell. This debate was broadcast on the BBC by them on their radio show, The Third Programme, and it was aired in 1948, although they didn't actually record it. It wasn't recorded until a year before. And then Bertrand Russell, this figure here, is a very well-known figure in the 20th century of philosophy. He was a logician, he was therefore a mathematician, he had interest in language, he was a philosopher, and he was a defender as well of atheism. He wrote a popular pamphlet and lecture, Why I Am Not a Christian, in 1927. But what's very interesting about this radio debate is that Russell makes it very clear from the beginning that he's not an atheist, he is an agnostic. And he does that for a very specific reason, despite actually the fact that he was probably more of an atheist in reality. He has this debate with Copleston, which is on the existence of God, and it's considered to be a classic form of philosophical discussion. The radio debate took place, as we said, in 1948, and it's considered to be a template for how to have a quality philosophical debate. And the reason for that is because they don't resort to personal insults when they feel like they're losing the argument. In other words, they avoid ad hominem arguments. They define the terms before they actually debate. And that's really important because they both need to understand what each other is saying. This would have been good for someone like Russell because he dealt with the area of language in his study. So they define the terms like God, like necessary being, like contingency, etc., and they agree on them or disagree on them. Then they set out their debate by laying down the premises that lead to conclusions, and then they challenge those premises one by one. A very important point to note down is that this debate is based on reason. It's not using revelation. Although Copleston was a Jesuit Catholic priest, it would be very easy for him to rely on scripture, on the Bible, to back up his claims. But instead, he avoids that on purpose and tries to use reason as the basis of his arguments. And the reason for that is because someone like Russell would have simply dismissed him early on in the debate had he done so. There's three parts to the radio debate. The first is the lengthy discussion they have on the cosmological argument. This is where you'll find familiar ground. Copleston bases his discussion on Aquinas' third way from contingency. He bases it on Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. And Russell responds by questioning whether or not necessary existence, known as aseity, is a meaningful idea. Can you put these ideas together? He famously leads on to his argument to say that the universe is a brute fact. He doesn't use that phrase in the debate, but it's what he means. A bit later on, the two agree to move on, and we find that Copleston raises the issue of religious experience. Again, trying to focus on reason, not on revelation when he does this. And so they start debating whether or not you can encounter God in the same way that you encounter a character in a novel or in a history book. And Russell thinks that religious experiences are far too subjective. They exist up here in the imagination, not in reality. And so it forces Copleston to convince him otherwise, and he uses religious experiences and links them to moral values in order to argue that, in fact, they're not as subjective as we think, but they have some objective value. In other words, they exist here in the real world. And so, as you can imagine, that argument ends inconclusively, and both of them agree to disagree, and they move on to the third section, which is on morality. But we don't need to know that, because your exam board only wants you to focus on the first two parts of the radio debate. And so here they are. On the left, you've got Copleston, and on the right, you've got Bertrand Russell. And I think it would be useful to hear the way that they speak and some of the things they say at this point. And so first of all, we listen to Frederick Copleston. He's now actually on the right-hand side in the image. And he outlines his principle of sufficient reason, the argument from contingency, as we can hear here.
Now, secondly, the world is simply the real or imagined totality or aggregate of individual objects, none of which contain in themselves alone the reason of their existence. There isn't any world distinct from the objects which form it, any more than the human race is something apart from the members. Therefore, I should say, since objects or events exist, and since no object of experience contains within itself the reason of its existence, this reason, the totality of objects, must have a reason external to itself.
What he's saying here is that the universe doesn't explain itself, and therefore it needs something outside of it to explain it sufficiently and fully. And he would lead on to argue that that being must be transcendent, therefore sit outside of time and space, and have that ability, a necessary being, a satiety. That being would be God. If we fast forward, we can hear Russell's immediate response to this use of necessary existence, and this is what Russell says.
Being. The word necessary, I should maintain, can only be applied significantly to propositions, and in fact only to such as are analytic, that is to say, such as it is self-contradictory to deny. I could only admit a necessary being if there were a being whose existence it is self-contradictory to deny.
And so what Russell is doing is attacking the use of necessary as an analytic idea and mixing it with a synthetic idea like being or existence. And so Russell says it doesn't make sense, in other words, it's meaningless to use the language of analytical philosophy, such as necessary, something which needs to exist, and link it to something that you've got to now try and prove exists, like God. And so that's where our debate really kicks off. And so what we're going to do is look at paragraph by paragraph the radio debate transcript. And you'll see the screen as you can now with the language they used, the script itself. There's going to be blue summaries, and that is in order for you to write down a brief summary of what it is saying in essence. And then you have questions in the black boxes, and those questions are helping us clarify, which is the 10 mark of your exam paper, the 10 mark clarify, illustrate question. These questions in the black boxes will help us unpack and highlight sections to understand better what it is that Copleston and Russell are saying. And then there'll be further, more implications and questions and points and ideas that take us deeper and further into analyzing, more to help us with the 20 mark aspect of your exam. And so we start here with this paragraph at the opening. In what three ways does Copleston define God? Because here Copleston lays out definitions of terms in order that Russell and he can debate God's existence. They agree on what they mean by God, and Russell goes on to say that he's agnostic rather than atheist. So in what three ways does Copleston define God? Well, let's highlight the three ways. He starts off by saying that the first way to understand God is as a supreme personal being. This reminds us perhaps of Descartes' famous definition of God in the Ontological Argument. The next is distinct from the world. And the third is creator of the world. And these are the three ways in which Copleston clearly defines God. So let's have a look at those three in a bit more detail. Supreme personal being, that simply means omnipotence. This is Copleston's way of saying God is a supreme, omnipotent or powerful being, and he is a personal being too, which means he has the agency to choose and act. He's not an impersonal force or energy out there, but he is a personal God. Remember, Copleston is a Jesuit Catholic priest. The second is that he is distinct from the world. This means God is transcendent. He must exist outside of time and space, and that's very necessary for Copleston to use as a definition, because he's going to argue, isn't he, later, that in order for the universe to have an explanation, it needs something outside of it. The third definition is that God is the creator of the world, and this, perhaps, we don't see Copleston use this language, but perhaps he's thinking about the design argument by Aquinas and the cosmological argument, saying that God is the first cause, the creator of all things. Now, what do we call this kind of God? Well, we would refer to this in philosophy as the God of classical theism. And why is it important for Copleston to define God in this way at the beginning? Well, because there are other types of definitions that exist out there of God. Other versions exist. We have a Buddhist understanding of God, for example, of consciousness. We have a Hindu understanding of God out there, of pantheism. We have the idea that God is perhaps both good and evil. We have Whitehead's process theodicy, which you should be familiar with from the problem of evil. That definition of God says that God isn't really all-powerful. He's limited in his omnipotence. So it's important that Copleston is clear about the God in which he's discussing. And so we might ask this question: what trap is Copleston setting Russell here? Because what we read is this. Perhaps, he says, you would tell me if your position is that of agnosticism or of atheism. Why has he asked that question to Russell? Because if Russell claims to be an atheist, he takes on the task of arguing that God probably does not exist. It's a really difficult argument to make. How do you prove God doesn't exist? And so Russell sees this coming, and instead what he does is he identifies, probably a little bit disingenuously, but he identifies as an agnostic. And his task then is simpler. He simply has to argue that there isn't good enough evidence to show that there is a God, not that there is evidence to show that there isn't a God. Very clever. And so we move on. Here, Copleston explains why he thinks that the existence of God is an important question, and Russell is less convinced by this. He agrees to hear out what Copleston says on his argument based on contingency. And so we're left asking the question, what would a world without God be like? This is something here that Copleston is asking. And so we can see here, he says, would you agree with me that the problem of God is a problem of great importance? For example, would you agree that if God does not exist, human beings and human history can have no other purpose than the purpose they choose to give themselves, which in practice is likely to mean the purpose which those impose who have the power to impose it? What Copleston is saying is, Russell, what would a world without God really be like? In fact, he's implying that a world without God wouldn't have any real absolutes. It wouldn't have any moral absolutes. And this is the first thing that he really wants to tackle. But this is about the implications of a world without God that Copleston is trying to highlight. And it's worth you mentioning this in your debate when you write about it in the exam. Now, what we can say here safely is that Russell avoids this. And this is because Russell was very interested in Marxism. He was very politically left-wing. He was pacifist in his politics. And because of the World War, Russell is somebody that didn't really have a belief in religion as being a positive role in society. And so when Copleston says to him things like, would you agree if there is no God, no absolute being, there can be no absolute values, what he's saying is that we can't actually have any absolute good. We can't have anything that can be great and good in the world unless we have God or religion. And so what Russell replies with is that he thinks that it is something which is logically distinct. He uses More's Principia Ethica, which you may remember from your studies in ethics. And he says that there's a distinction of good and of evil. And he says you can have a distinction of good and evil without, he does not bring in the idea of God. You don't need religion or God in order to make sense of the difference between that which is good and that which is evil. So what Russell does is he sidesteps Copleston's point, and he says that you can have morality, you can have absolutes, you can have clear distinctions between knowing what is right and wrong, good and evil in society without needing God. In other words, God is not necessary. And so he gets out of this trap that Copleston is setting. And so we move on to the argument from contingency, which Copleston sets out. And here we can see a summary of effectively what he believes in blue. And it's worth you writing these down because we will revisit these a little bit later on. Premise 1, everything in the universe is contingent. That means everything depends on something else to exist. Premise 2, the universe is the aggregate, which means the sum total of all things in it. Conclusion 1, therefore, the universe is contingent because everything in it depends on something to exist. Premise 3, contingent things require an explanation. We need to know everything must have an explanation to why it depends on something. Something caused it to exist. Conclusion 2, therefore the universe requires an explanation because we've just agreed the universe is contingent in its sum total. Premise 4, an infinite regress of explanations is not an explanation. If we accept that there's an infinite regress, we end up saying that there will never be a sufficient explanation, a full explanation, because you'll keep having to ask the question of what caused that, etc. Conclusion 3, therefore, an entity that possesses necessary existence, or aseity, is needed to explain the universe. You should be familiar with this. So what are the conditions that Copleston points out here that are in the past and in the present? Well, let's have a look. He says that there are conditions in the past, first of all. And these conditions that he mentions would be things like his parents. That's conditions from the past because had his parents not met or that meeting had not occurred, then his existence would have been impossible. Our existence would be impossible if our parents never met. And he also says that there are conditions of the present as well. And these are things here, the air, the food, and so on. The air that we breathe, the food that we eat, if they were to disappear, it would make also our existence impossible because we are contingent on them to exist. And here's a short video clip just to highlight this point to you, that what would happen in a world if the oxygen in the world disappeared for just 5 seconds? Everyone at the beach gets sunburned. Molecular oxygen in the air protects our skin against UV light. The daytime sky would get darker. Fewer particles to bounce light. Dark, almost blackened sky. All pieces of untreated metal would instantly spot weld to each other. The only thing preventing it from sticking together is the layer of oxidation. The Earth's crust would crumble. Oxygen makes up 45% of the Earth's crust. Everyone's inner ear would explode because we would lose 21% of the air pressure. Every building made out of concrete would turn to dust. Oxygen is an important binder in concrete. Every living cell would explode in a haze of hydrogen gas. And so there you have it. We, Copleston says, depend on conditions from the past and conditions from the present, otherwise we wouldn't exist. So let's say, would we agree with premise 1 of his argument, that everything in the universe is contingent? Well, of course we would. Everyone is going to agree. It's pretty irrefutable. So would we agree with premise 2, that the universe is the aggregate, the sum total of all the things in it? Well, not so. Less certain. Just because everything in the universe is contingent, it doesn't actually make the universe contingent. Hume, in his Fallacy of Composition, which you might remember Russell uses in the cosmological argument as a criticism, argues this. If you have a look at a picture of a wall like this, with very small bricks in it that make it up, you might conclude initially that this is a small wall. But actually, the small bricks in the wall, looking at it in a part, does not make the whole wall small. In fact, it could be a massive wall made up of little small bricks. That's the fallacy of composition, taking one part of something and applying it to the whole. Would you agree with premise 3, then? Contingent things require an explanation. Why doesn't a rejection of an infinite regress need an explanation? Copleston doesn't seem to want to give one to that. Why can't there, in other words, be an actual infinite universe? These are the things that Russell is raising as questions. Copleston thought it was just silly to simply explain the universe with something. So he needs an explanation. It would be silly to explain the universe with something that simply needs an explanation. So he said, God is the best one. He doesn't need an explanation. God doesn't need one. And so we can ask this question. What is it that Copleston is talking about? He's talking here about explanations, not causes. He's not bothered about the cause right now of the universe. He's saying that the universe demands an explanation for its existence. And therefore, since it cannot give one itself, it needs something greater than it that can. Now that, he says, is God. So in this next section, Russell ignores an infinite regress and he discusses Copleston's necessary being argument instead. He moves on. He doesn't get tied up in the infinite regress debate. What is an example of an analytic proposition? Because this is the focus here that Russell has on Copleston's use of a necessary being. And we can find that here when we read this section of the extract. But to my mind, a necessary proposition has got to be analytic. This is Russell speaking. So what is an example of an analytic proposition? Well, it might look something like this. If A plus B equals C, then C minus B equals A. In other words, the example is necessary. What is Russell's example then of an analytic proposition which he says is necessarily true? Well, let's have a look at his example that he gives. Irrational animals are animals. He says that this is an analytic proposition which is necessarily true. Animals are animals. You can't get away from that. And so what do we call these statements? We call statements like this tautologies. Statements which are true by definition. This should remind you of the beginning groundwork you did when you started studying the course in philosophy. Tautologies are statements which are true by definition. Animals are animals. Doesn't matter if they're irrational or not, it doesn't change anything. Now, what don't tautologies do when we use them? Well, the problem is tautologies do not tell us anything new about the world. They don't add any knowledge at all to our understanding of something when we see their statements. Russell, in this case then, doesn't see how a being or a person could possibly be necessary and also be considered an analytic proposition. And so this leads on to Russell's criticism. Claiming that something exists or offering an explanation is a different sort of statement. It's what philosophers, instead of calling them analytic statements, they will call them synthetic statements. Now, the truth of a synthetic statement is never obvious or self-evident. It's not true by definition. You have to check it out. You've got to go and see for yourself or prove it with evidence. So what is Russell's example of a synthetic statement? Well, it's down here. This is an animal. Can you think of some others? Let's take the Ferrero Rocher here. In order to believe the Ferrero Rocher and the statement that the Ferrero Rocher tastes of hazelnut, you would have to actually unwrap it and put it in your mouth and eat it, because it's a synthetic argument. It's a synthetic statement. You've got to taste it. You've got to prove it. You've got to check it out yourself with the evidence. Saying over here, this is an animal, you've got to see it to believe the statement. It's a synthetic statement. None of these examples are necessarily true. You've got to find out for yourself. So, what would Russell say then about the statement that Copleston is using? The statement, God exists. God is a necessary being with necessary existence. He's going to say it's not an analytic proposition, it's a synthetic one. But is he right for saying that? So moving on here, Copleston tries to defend his use of the term necessary being. He's just been attacked by Russell for saying it, and Russell says it's not analytic. Copleston defends it, but Russell insists that the word necessary just cannot mean anything outside of the world of pure logic. Now, Copleston says that you can have an analytical statement that isn't a tautology. What did Immanuel Kant say about this? Well, Kant said that you cannot have anything which is analytic and which is an a posteriori. This is knowledge from experience. But others may disagree. They say that you can have statements which are both analytic, true by definition, and a posteriori, that get our knowledge from our experience, tell us facts about the world. And here's an example of this. An American philosopher and logician, Saul Crick. There he is. He says this, and this statement is based on some developments over time. Hesperus is phosphorus. Now, Hesperus is the evening star. You can see it there in the image. And that appears in the night sky after sunset. Phosphorus is the name given to the morning star, and that appears in the night sky before sunrise. And in the past, people used to think that those were two different, separate, distinct stars. But we now know that they are both, in fact, the planet Venus. So when we say, like Saul here, Hesperus is phosphorus, what we're doing is taking an a posteriori statement, because it tells us something from our observation, our experience, our knowledge comes from our experience here, the statement that tells the listener a simple fact, that there are two stars, which are really called Venus. But it's an analytical statement too, because they are both different names for the same thing. They are true by definition. Hesperus by definition is phosphorus, and phosphorus by definition is Hesperus, and by definition they are both Venus. Now this would be a very good example of where a statement which is analytically true is not a tautology, because we are able to also have a posteriori knowledge. But however, as you can imagine, Bertrand Russell disagrees. Take the famous linguistics philosopher, Chomsky. He came up with this sentence: colorless green ideas sleep furiously. What is possibly wrong with that sentence? Well, think about this. The word colorless and the word green are put together in the same sentence. they both are meaningful words in and of themselves. We understand what it means to have no color. We understand what it means to have the color green. But you can't put them together to describe a thing as colorless green. And then let's look at the word idea. The word idea makes perfect sense, but you can't describe an idea as being green. You could describe an idea as being imaginative, an imaginative idea, or a nasty idea. And so Chomsky illustrates that just because the English language lets you put two words together in a sentence, it doesn't mean that they are going to make sense. Now, Russell regards necessary being as rather like Chomsky's idea here of colorless green ideas. It's a misuse, he says, of the English language to put words together in this way. And he uses the father of modern linguistics to make this point. So Russell disagrees, and he says that necessary is a useless word when used outside of logical proofs. It simply cannot be applied to things. So here, Copleston accuses Russell of being dogmatic, stubborn, closed-minded, for refusing to admit that a being could have necessary existence. Not all philosophers agree that analytic statements are meaningless tautologies. And Copleston wants to raise this issue. He does this quite a lot throughout the debate. He accuses Russell of being stubborn and dogmatic, and we see this a few times, and there's an amusing point later on where Russell avoids this idea of being called dogmatic before Copleston has the chance to say it again. But looking at this part of the extract, can you figure out who the very eminent modern thinker is? Let's have a look at where he says that. He says, one very eminent modern thinker whose knowledge of modern logic was profound. We were unlikely to guess that, so I'll let you in on the secret. It was Alfred Whitehead. Does that name sound familiar? He was the philosopher that came up with process theodicy. Now, what's really interesting here is that Alfred Whitehead collaborated with Bertrand Russell on a book about the philosophy of mathematics. They were friends. And here we have Copleston using Whitehead's process theodicy to give a rebuttal to Bertrand Russell. So what is process theodicy, and why is it strange for Copleston to mention it? Well, process theodicy is simply the idea that God is an evolving part of the world rather than a transcendent creator. This is a very different idea to the Catholic God that Copleston does believe in. So it's very strange to use, because we know process theodicy says that God is limited in power, he's not really omnipotent. But what he's doing is irritating Bertrand Russell, because Bertrand Russell would have been very irritated since his friend was Whitehead, and his friend is being used against him in the argument. And even worse, and even more insensitive, is that Whitehead died the same year that they were having this debate. Now, what does Copleston mean when he accuses Bertrand Russell of having an assumed philosophy? Let's highlight that there. To be a proposition based on assumed philosophy. What does he mean? Well, assumed philosophy, he means taking a position and being awkward about it. There's a refusal here to admit that necessary can be applied to things rather than just ideas. And so Copleston compares Bertrand Russell to someone with religious dogma, someone who's stubborn and won't give up. And again, another insult really to Russell to argue that he is acting like someone who is religiously stubborn. And so we raise questions here. Is Russell being dogmatic in refusing to admit that necessary as a word can apply to something existing? Or is Copleston being dogmatic here in refusing to admit that the word simply cannot be used in the way that he wants? That's for you to analyze and decide. Who's the real stubborn one here between the two? Maybe it's both. This next section, here they discuss the ontological argument, surprisingly. And Russell denies being dogmatic, as he would. He says not all statements about God have to be analytic. He's just got a problem with the word necessary, because necessary is always analytic, he argues. And he thinks it's wrong for Copleston to use it here. So can we pick out the parts of the ontological argument that Bertrand Russell tackles here? Well, we can see very clearly in the second paragraph that after Russell says, I'm not being dogmatic, he then highlights parts of the ontological argument and focuses heavily on Immanuel Kant and the predicates that he rejects. We can see here the ontological argument. There is a being whose essence involves existence. And again, it's this use of the word existence. And implying that his existence is analytic. And he thinks this is impossible as an idea. And of course, it raises the question of what you mean by existence. And then he simply agrees with Immanuel Kant in the way that Kant disagreed with Descartes when he says quite definitely is not a predicate. You can't say existence is a predicate of something. That should be familiar to you. And so then we ask the question, now we've identified what Russell is focusing on, how does he link this to bad grammar? We can see that Copleston's picked up on this. I believe that it is bad grammar, you say. And so that is what Russell is saying. Russell's take on Immanuel Kant's criticism of predicates is that it is a form of bad grammar. You can't put these words necessary and existence or being together. Now, Russell is the one that's brought up the ontological argument, but Copleston doesn't really care to talk about it. There's a few reasons for this. Now, what is Bertrand Russell arguing when he talks about a round square? Let's have a look at this. He says, the existent round square. Well, Russell maintains his focus on the idea of a necessary being being a case of bad grammar after Copleston says, I don't think it is. And he gives the example of something being a round square. Well, that's a logical impossibility, isn't it? If something is round, that makes it impossible to be square, and vice versa. In other words, you can define something as the existent round square in the same way that you can define something as the necessary being that exists. But it's impossible for it to be true, because round square is a contradiction, in the same way that necessary being, he says, is also a contradiction. But Copleston wants to avoid debating this. He doesn't care to discuss this. But Russell presses the point. Why does he want to debate the ontological argument early on right now? I thought they were talking about the cosmological argument. I thought they were talking about the argument from contingency. And here, Russell presses the point. He wants to debate the ontological argument. Well, there's a reason for this. Immanuel Kant, in his work, The Critique of Pure Reason, and David Hume, rather, in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, two very well-known, famous works here of philosophy. Hume combined both the cosmological argument and the ontological argument together. And Immanuel Kant argued that if you destroy the ontological argument, you can destroy the cosmological argument. Now, this is really important. Russell knows from his work, and this is one of the things he's famous for, that if he can show that necessary existence is a contradiction, or that it is a meaningless statement because it's not analytically correct to say those things together, then Copleston's argument from contingency collapses. In the same way that Immanuel Kant, David Hume, when David Hume put them together when he criticized them, and Immanuel Kant believed that if you attack the ontological argument, you deal with the cosmological argument. If you get rid of one, you get rid of the other. Russell was trying to do the same. And so he says, if I can get Copleston to fall into the trap here of debating the ontological argument, he's going to lose. And if he loses that argument, he's lost his argument based on contingency, based on the cosmological argument. Because that's what his whole argument from contingency depends on. Clever. And so what happens is Copleston and Russell, they try to agree on what they mean by the term necessary being. There are three definitions from Bertrand Russell and Copleston here as they discuss what a necessary being is. Now, the first one, a being that must exist and cannot not exist. There we go, a being that must exist and cannot not exist. Then it develops to a being whose essence involves existence. A being, the essence of which is to exist, is the third one. And then we have the other one, there we go. A being that must exist and cannot not exist would be a being whose essence involves existence. So we've got a being that must exist and cannot not exist, we've got a being whose essence involves existence, and we've got a being the essence of which is to exist. These are the three definitions in which they're wrestling with and they attempt to agree on. Now, what is Copleston not willing to argue here? He's not willing to be hijacked by Bertrand Russell, and he refuses at this stage to argue the ontological argument. And we see this when he says this here. I should not be willing to argue the existence of God simply from the idea of his essence. And he is unwilling. Why is he not willing? He is unwilling because he doesn't think we have any clear intuition of God's essence as yet. So he's very clear. He wants to avoid the trap that we've just seen Russell try and set. So what kind of argument does Copleston suggest is necessary to discuss? Unsurprisingly, argue from the world of experience. What kind of argument is that? That's a posteriori knowledge. It's an a posteriori type argument. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because his influencer is Aquinas. He's influenced rather by Aquinas, who focused heavily on a posteriori arguments in what he wrote. And so that makes sense. He's avoiding the trap. He's trying to get the argument back on course to talk about a posteriori debate. Now, Russell agrees on the distinction that's made between their definitions. And he gives up pushing the ontological argument onto Copleston. We said at the beginning, didn't we? They were polite. Why was Copleston relieved by this? Well, as we said before, we've learned that if Russell can get him to fall to pieces with the ontological argument, then he's beat him at the cosmological argument. But there's another reason. 1947 to 1948, there weren't any modal arguments for the ontological argument in existence. Now, if you remember from your Year 12 AS knowledge, you studied the classic forms of Anselm and Descartes, and they were crippled by Kant and Russell and Hume. But later on, we have the modal arguments. And these are arguments that reason about what is necessary, about what is possible, about what is impossible. You've studied Hartshorne or Plantinga or Malcolm. And these arguments are the modern modal arguments that avoid the issue of existence being a predicate. And so Russell, Kant, they would not be able to argue the modal arguments in the same way. And so because Malcolm and Plantinga hadn't been created, these arguments hadn't been created yet, to avoid Kant and Russell's criticisms, the ontological argument was considerably weakened by Kant's criticism of existence as a predicate, but even more so by Russell, who had done great damage to both classic forms of the ontological argument. And one of the things he was famous for, Copleston needed to get out of this trap in 1947 because he was about to be defeated monumentally. Now, Copleston rejected the ontological argument for the same reasons that Aquinas did. What did he believe? Well, both of them were Catholic. They both said that we're unable to know God's essence with limited knowledge. And so we need to use the knowledge that we have from the world around us. Remember Aquinas's Summa Theologica? We have his 5 ways, all based on a posteriori knowledge. Revelation as well from the Bible. And so if we go back to the extract for a second, what did Copleston mean by as yet? If you see the red circle, as yet. His essence, because I don't think we have any clear intuition of God's essence as yet. Well, Copleston was referring to the afterlife here. Catholics believe, mostly from Aquinas, that they will have partial understanding of God's essence in heaven. When might he get clear intuition of God's essence? There it is, clear intuition of God's essence. He's going to get it in the afterlife. Now, intuition is also a very interesting word that Copleston uses here. Intuition could be another term used to refer to mystical experiences, and this is perhaps why the second part of the debate moves on to religious experience. William James said, as you remember, that these are ineffable. One of the key features of a mystical experience is ineffability. Not being able to explain in words the experience or the intuition. So actually, Copleston probably doesn't do himself much justice to Russell by saying the word intuition at this point, because Russell is scratching his head thinking, but hold on a minute, this would be absolutely useless in a debate with me, because to say that you can't explain or put into words or you have limited knowledge of the thing that you're talking about means that we shouldn't really be bothering to talk about it because it's meaningless. It's a rubbish thing to discuss. Now, this is rather interesting. Copleston seems to avoid it because Russell doesn't quite pick up on this use of the word intuition and take him to town on it. And so we move on, and they move on to discuss Leibniz's sufficient reason, which is what Copleston was basing the argument on from contingency. And Russell wants to know what Copleston means by the term sufficient reason. So let's highlight Copleston's definition of a sufficient reason. So he says here, by sufficient reason, in the full sense, I mean an explanation adequate for the existence of some particular being. That's his definition. If the explanation, God, is adequate, sufficient, what is there no longer a need for? Well, if we're able to say that the explanation of God is a sufficient explanation, an adequate one, there's no longer a need for any more questions. What caused this? How did this happen? Why are we here? We don't need to ask anymore because God is the sufficient reason. Now, what Russell does is he creates an analogy of striking a match. He discusses this analogy and he's making a particular argument. We can see the analogy here. Suppose I am to make a flame with a match. You may say that the adequate explanation of that is that I rub it on the box. So Russell is arguing that if you ask, what's the explanation for the flame? And the reply is someone struck a match, whether it would actually be a sufficient reason that's been given if someone just says someone struck a match. So what is Copleston's reply to this? Copleston simply says, well, for practical purposes, no, there is only a partial explanation. There's not a total explanation. An adequate explanation must ultimately be a total explanation where nothing further can be added. In other words, you have nothing left to say. There's no more questions. So he agrees with Russell's analogy and says that it wouldn't be. It would only be a partial explanation. But what's Russell doing with this analogy? He's creating another trap. What is the trap that he is making here? Well, we know that in order for it to be a sufficient reason, you've got to have a full explanation. So in this case of the analogy, you strike the match, you may want to know where you got the matches from, where the matchbox came from, why the sulfur reacts to the friction the way it does, and then produces the flame, etc. So Russell is creating a trap. How do we highlight it? It's here, when he says, then I can only say that you are looking for something which can't be got and which one ought not to expect to get. In other words, the search for a total explanation for something is a total waste of time, according to Bertrand Russell. He's saying to Copleston, you're never going to have it. Now, what does Copleston accuse Russell of once more? You've guessed it. He says, it seems to me you are being rather dogmatic. So let's have a little look at Leibniz's ideas. Leibniz says that nothing takes place without a sufficient reason. This is recapping your knowledge of the cosmological argument. Even if we cannot solve the explanation fully, there's still going to be one. So even if we don't yet fully know the explanation for something, there's going to be one. Doesn't mean that there isn't. So he distinguished between proximate reasons and sufficient reasons. Proximate reasons are partial explanations, and sufficient reasons are total explanations. And so therefore, this is the difference between the analogy of the match with a proximate reason just given simply that you struck the match, and the demand for a sufficient reason where you never need to ask any more questions. So imagine this. If someone died of a heart attack and the doctor said it's because their heart stopped beating, that would only be a proximate reason, a partial explanation. That's because we're probably going to want to know the underlying cause. So was it a virus? And then we might even want to know what kind of virus and where did the virus come from to help us get a better understanding of how this person, maybe they were in their 30s, had a heart attack. Now, Copleston agrees with Leibniz that we should look beyond the proximate reasons. And we should search, we should still look, even if we don't know yet, we should still look for the sufficient reason. Here's Russell again. Russell disagrees with Leibniz, with Copleston, and he thinks that proximate reasons are good enough. It's enough to have a partial reason, as long as they are practical. A sufficient reason, he says, remember, can't be got and is one ought not to expect to get. That's what he says of Copleston's principle of sufficient reason. But we could question this. I mean, imagine your well-traveled burrito if you bought a burrito. You might be satisfied, like Bertrand Russell, and you'll simply get by with a proximate reason, a partial reason for the existence of your burrito or anything else that you choose to buy and eat. But you might be curious for a sufficient reason, and you might want to consider the ethics of where your food came from. Look at where it was sourced. Look at how ethical it was sourced all around the world, the different components of your burrito. And so we're left with the question at this stage of the debate, is Russell right to dismiss the search for a total explanation of things? Should we simply be satisfied with a partial explanation, or should we, like Copleston and Leibniz, go looking Even if we don't know yet, go looking for the sufficient reason for things. And so we move on. Russell suggests that the universe isn't something we can meaningfully look for a cause of explanation for, but Copleston argues that we should. So Russell says that it isn't something, the universe, that we can meaningfully look for, but Copleston says we should look for. What is Russell's problem with needing an explanation which makes the other thing dependent on yet another? Here is where he says that, which makes the other thing dependent on yet another. Well, the problem, he says, is that looking for explanations involves looking for proximate causes. And we're going to keep looking for deeper explanations. And eventually, he says, we're going to get confused. Russell says that we're incapable of grasping the bigger picture. You have to grasp, he says, this sorry scheme of things. It's also a phrase, by the way, that Copleston picks up on and uses. He says, yes, the whole of this sorry scheme of things. What do they mean when they were referring to the sorry scheme of things? Well, the sorry scheme of things is simply the whole universe, everything that there is. What does Russell think about the word universe? Well, he says here that the word universe is a handy word, but it doesn't have any meaning because we cannot fully understand it. I don't think, he says, it stands for anything that has meaning. So what is Copleston's definition of the universe? We need to go back to premise 2. Here he says, I indicated that in my brief summary of the proof. So if you go all the way back to your notes with the premises and the conclusions at the beginning of the lessons, you will understand what Copleston's definition of the universe is. Remember, it is the aggregate, the sum total of everything. Can you imagine what the universe really means? What other handy words are used a lot but mean not very much? Think about this sentence. What do women want? Well, women relates to 49.55% of the world's population. They all want different things. They're all individual. And this word, therefore, means very little. Take this image of gynecology, a smear test that women have all the time across the world. In the Department of Gynecology, which specializes specifically in women, not in men. And so women here is a useful word because we can understand its context and its meaning. For Russell, universe is a meaningful word for people like astronomers to use because it's got a practical sense to it. But it isn't for philosophers. Women, for a gynecologist, has a practical, clear understanding of its use. But a statement like, what do women want, means very little to the rest of the world. The word universe is not meaningful for philosophers when looking for an explanation. Let's go back to this extract. What does Copleston challenge Russell to admit or deny about the universe? Well, it's found here if you highlight that word unintelligible. Copleston challenges Russell to admit or deny that he thinks the universe is unintelligible and simply cannot be understood. So now Russell argues that we should look for causes or explanations behind the particular things, but not for a cause or an explanation for the entire thing, the entire universe. So what's Russell's response to Copleston when asked if he thinks the universe, in our last slide, is unintelligible? How does he respond to this? Well, Russell defends himself by saying that the universe is without explanation. And here we find it here. I shouldn't say unintelligible. I think it is without explanation. Rather than unintelligible, it simply is without explanation. How does Copleston come back with Russell's point here using his chocolate analogy? So we can ask where a piece of chocolate like this comes from. We can ask where an entire box comes from. If there were infinite chocolate, we could ask where they come from. Thus, we can ask, he says, where the universe comes from, and we can seek a sufficient reason. And that summarizes that whole paragraph there by Copleston in essence. So why does Russell refuse to accept this point made by Copleston using the analogy of infinite chocolate? Russell, he says that you cannot jump from explaining particular things to explaining the total. And he says it right here down the bottom. I see no reason whatsoever to suppose that the total has any cause whatsoever, because the whole concept of cause is one we derive from our observation of particular things. You can't jump from explaining particular things to explaining the total, taking one part and applying it to the whole. He's setting himself up here to discuss the fallacy of composition. He's making his way to hit Copleston with this famous argument derived by David Hume. Now, Russell and Copleston move on to discuss the idea of the universe as a brute fact. Although we don't really see this phrase being used, it is the phrase that later people Russell became famous for being known as. So what does Copleston accuse Russell of in his opening argument? Copleston accuses Russell of concluding that there isn't a cause before even looking for an explanation, because Russell assumes the universe has no cause and then refuses to go and look for one. We see this here. To say that there isn't any cause is not the same thing as saying that we shouldn't look for a cause. Russell has been accused here of arguing that there isn't a cause before even looking for one. Russell assumes the universe doesn't have a cause, and he doesn't even bother to go and look for one. He just refuses. What does Russell say to deny this accusation? He says, the concept of cause is not applicable to the total. Quite straightforward. So you should now be exposed a little bit to Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who Copleston introduces at this point in the debate. He says, then you would agree with Sartre that the universe is what he calls gratuitous. Now we need to get our heads around this a little bit to understand what Copleston's doing. It's a very clever ploy of Copleston to bring in Jean-Paul Sartre at the minute. And this is Copleston trying to bring Russell into a trap again. Now, Jean-Paul Sartre was a French philosopher. He was an existentialist. Existence precedes essence is what he was famous for believing. And in a world without God, humans must create their own meanings for things. The universe is described as gratuitous. We can see this phrase here. Twice being used, Copleston and Russell, they discuss what it means. Well, gratuitous means unnecessary or pointless. And this is a phrase that Sartre used. So he argues that the universe is simply a pointless thing. Now, how does Russell redefine Sartre's definition? Because if he agrees, which he would agree in part with Sartre, but if he agrees with Copleston's use of Sartre, saying that, well, are you saying like Sartre that the universe is pointless, is unnecessary? Russell says, well, the word gratuitous suggests that it might be something else. He redefines it. He says this, I should say that the universe is just there and that's all. And there we have it, the brute fact argument. I should say that the universe is just there and that's all. What's the quote here that we can find from Copleston that highlights Leibniz's view? The quote from Leibniz that Copleston uses in his reply to Russell. We can find it here when he says, why something rather than nothing? Why something rather than nothing? That is the question. Why something rather than nothing? That is the question. That's how he responds to Russell saying the universe is just there, it's a brute fact. Now, Russell is really important here. Russell is making way to hit Copleston with his fallacy of composition argument again in the next bit. But just to give you a little sense of perhaps why Russell was a bit reluctant to agree fully with Sartre's definition of the universe. Sartre wasn't particularly the most popular thinker. Sartre believed the universe was absurd. He believed that life is all unhappy and consciousness, life is consciousness, useless, a useless passion, an unhappy consciousness. There's no reason for us to exist. All life is pointless. Just take this little comic strip. All right, gang, we need to get the word out there on how absurd and pointless life is. Why? What's the point? What do people generally do when they fall into nihilist despair? Find religion? What? No, they drink. Ah, smart. So we've got to get people really feeling that despair, and then they can come on down to Pierre's pub to dull the pain of existence, and we're going to profit from it. Exactly. I've created these flyers, and his flyer says, life is absurd. You should probably just kill yourself. All right, I feel it's a little bit heavy on the killing yourself. Is people killing themselves really what we want? How are they going to spend money at the bar if they go around doing that? Yeah, I was wondering about that myself. Oh, I just feel like you guys aren't getting it. Let's just go hand out the flyers and you're going to see. What the hell? People are just throwing them away. We live in a throwaway culture, Camus. Exactly. You give people profound truths about the absurd nature of their lives, and they'll just toss it away like trash. You know, I feel like we've been going about this the whole wrong way. A flyer isn't going to change anyone's mind. We've got to really show them how profound, empty, and miserable their lives really are. And this is the kind of thinking that Sartre had, not a particularly popular one. So you can imagine why Russell was quick to be reluctant in fully agreeing that the universe is all these things that we've just seen. And actually, instead, what he does is he just says, look, let's just accept the universe as a fact. It exists, and that's it. So let's go back to the extract. This is how Copleston sets a trap in asking them, you would agree with Sartre, Russell. See, there we go. Then you would agree with Sartre, wouldn't you, based on what you've just said? And Russell didn't want to fully agree, because on Earth, who does? Who would want to fully agree? Does Russell here, and this is an important question that we could ask at this stage, does Russell lack imagination and curiosity about the universe? Should we be, us, this emotionless about the universe? Would we end up being a bit like Jean-Paul Sartre? Maybe there's more that meets the eye. So let's move on. Russell now uses the fallacy of composition, what we've been all waiting for, influenced by David Hume, to argue his case. So where's the analogy that Russell uses to make his case for the fallacy of composition? Where do we find it? It's found here. Every man who exists has a mother. And it seems to me your argument is that therefore the human race must have a mother. There's the analogy. You should be reminded of this. Let's go back to the brick wall analogy, because Russell again talks about this. And this will help us understand Russell's view of contingency. What does he liken it to? He likens it here to a brick wall. If you think about this, if all the bricks were red, the wall would be red. Is this a true statement? Would we agree with that? Of course we would. It's a true statement. What if all the bricks in the wall were small? The wall would be small. Is that a true statement? No, of course it isn't. The wall could be very large with lots of small bricks, as we said earlier. Now, Russell shows that the fallacy is in Copleston assuming contingency and therefore failing to prove God's existence, even though it may be a possibility. Why can Russell accept this? Well, because for Russell, contingency is likened to the smallness of the wall. Just because all things in the universe are contingent, it doesn't mean the universe has to be contingent, in the same way that the wall has to be a small wall. Russell claims at the start, remember, that he is an agnostic, not an atheist. That's how Russell can accept all of this, because he claims he's an agnostic. There could be a possibility that God exists, but the fallacy is in Copleston assuming contingency and failing to prove it. And he can accept the idea that there could be a possibility, that he's an agnostic after all. Here we get all a bit scientific. Copleston argues that being a scientist involves assuming that there are causes and explanations out there to be discovered. And therefore, Russell is being very unscientific here in denying a discovery. And that's the accusation Copleston makes. Now, why does Russell use quantum physics, of all things, to make his case here? I mean, it's a very interesting point in the debate. He says, I don't want to seem arrogant. I mean, how many people, when they start off saying, I don't want to seem arrogant, are probably going to be arrogant? He says, but it does seem to me that I conceive things that you say the human mind can't conceive. Wow. As for things not having a cause, the physicists assure us that individual quantum transitions in atoms have no cause. Well, quantum physics, and we need to get a little bit scientific here, deals with subatomic particles, which can come into existence and go out of existence without any cause at all. Now, this means that there isn't a cause for everything, according to Russell. Now, what does Copleston mean when he says, well, I wonder now whether that isn't simply a temporary inference? Now, Copleston argues that scientists simply haven't found the cause yet, because it's a temporary inference until they find the cause. So, of course, they may not have a cause. There may be things that don't seem to have a cause, like these atoms, but actually, it's just because the scientists haven't found the cause. It's a temporary inference. How is this reinforced? By Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And Copleston uses this to show off some of his knowledge, scientific knowledge that he has. I think that Professor Dingle of London University maintains that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle tells us something about the success or lack of it of the present atomic theory in correlating observations. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which you can see here, we're going to attempt to briefly look at this, argues that you can never know the exact position and momentum of a subatomic particle. We have the uncertainty in position, and we have the uncertainty in momentum. The more accurately you know the position, the less accurately you know the momentum, and vice versa. Now, Copleston says that we cannot know exact details about the particles. It's not that they are random or that they are uncaused. We just have uncertainty because we haven't yet found out. It's a little bit like his point about proximate reasons, when he says that they're not enough, and there will still be a sufficient reason to something, even though you don't know it yet. You just need to keep looking. So we go back to the text. How and why does Copleston compare a physicist to a detective? Well, he says, I agree, some scientists are willing to allow for indetermination within a restricted field, but very many scientists are not so willing. And then he goes on to talk about detectives down the bottom here. How does he compare a physicist, and why does he do it? Well, a physicist looks for causes in the same way a detective looks for causes to solve a murder. He believes philosophers should also be looking for a cause for the universe. What other argument does Copleston refer to with this phrase, order and intelligibility in nature? He's referring here to the design argument, order and regularity. Aquinas, remember, influenced Copleston. Nature shows beneficial order. Copleston argues that science depends on the assumption that there is order and intelligibility in nature. Can you spot the type of argument that Copleston has now shifted to in this debate? At the start of the debate, what argument did he put forward? He put forward a deductive argument. Remember, contingent universe requires a necessary being to explain it. That's a deductive argument. But now he's putting forward an inductive argument. He shifted. He assumes the universe is contingent, so there's probably a necessary being to explain it. Detectives work on the basis of probability. A physicist looks for causes in the same way a detective looks for them to solve a murder. The philosopher should be looking for the probability that points to a necessary being to explain it. This is the shift, and it's a very sly one, but the shift in argument that Copleston uses. So Russell then offers an alternative understanding of what scientists do and what he thinks philosophers ought to do. At the moment, they're debating what a scientist should do, what a philosopher should do, and it's all getting very complicated. How does Russell's gold prospector analogy argue against Copleston's view that scientific research assumes the existence of causes? Here we can see a man may look for gold without assuming that there is gold everywhere. If he finds gold, well and good. If he doesn't, he's had bad luck. And the same is true when the physicist looks for causes. Russell says that scientists hope to find causes, but they don't assume that they're there. The gold prospector might find gold in the mountains, or he might not. They just don't assume that there has to be gold there. They go looking, and if they come across it, it's a bit of good luck or it's a bit of bad luck. Now, Russell here believes that if a cause cannot be found, the scientist should and must give up looking. But Copleston disagrees, and he believes that a scientist wouldn't start looking without assuming a cause to begin with, and then they go in pursuit. Now here the debate reaches a standoff, and it concludes, and it goes nowhere. It's right at the end. Here's the conclusion of the debate from the argument from contingency. What are the reasons that they move on? Well, it's quite straightforward. Neither of them are trained scientists, and it becomes quite difficult for them to argue with each other using science. What does Copleston argue here? Copleston says, your general point then, Lord Russell, is that it's illegitimate even to ask the question of the cause of the world. In other words, Russell, you don't think we can even talk about the cause of the world. And Russell agrees. Yes, that's my position. And then Copleston says, well, in that case then, it's pretty difficult to discuss, isn't it? And then we get Russell come back and say, yes, it's very difficult. What do you say we should do? Let's pass on to some other issue. And that's why they move on now to religious experience, the next part of their argument. So here Copleston introduces religious experience as an inductive argument. Remember, he's just shifted from deductive to inductive, and it makes sense why. He's about to talk about an inductive argument. But not as a proof of God's existence. Instead, he wants to simply show that the existence of God is more likely than not, more probable than it isn't. So we need to identify here the 5 important characteristics of religious experience according to Copleston. And we're going to see that your knowledge of religious experience comes into play here, because he draws upon William James's mystical experience features and a little bit of Rudolf Otto. So let's have a look. If we highlight these sections, the first is this: a loving but unclear awareness of some object. The next is irresistibly transcending the self. That's the second one. You should number them. The third is something which cannot be pictured or conceptualized. The fourth is doubt which is impossible, at least during the experience. And then the fifth, when he says that there is actually some objective cause of that experience. Now, these are the 5 important characteristics. So I'm going to bring them up now so we can see what each one means. So the first one, loving but unclear awareness, is Copleston describing mystical experiences. So you should label that as mystical experiences. Now, if we go back to the text, he later excludes from this category a particular aspect of a mystical experience. If we go back, he disregards visions. He excludes visions for being too similar to hallucinations. And we see that down here at the bottom. I'm speaking strictly of mystical experience proper, and I certainly don't include, by the way, what are called visions. And that's because he argues that they're they could be easily argued to be an hallucination, and therefore they're easily criticized. So he avoids that being a criticism of Russell. So let's go back to the definitions. The second one is irresistibly transcending the self. And this is his reference to Rudolf Otto with his idea of the numinous. This is the idea of the numinous. The third cannot be pictured or conceptualized. Now, the William James feature here he's referring to is ineffability. Then we've got doubt is impossible, at least during the experience. There are 2 of James's features we could find here. One is transiency, which is the idea that the experience comes and then it leaves. And then the other one is passivity, which is that the experience happens to you and you are almost abandoned to allowing the experience to happen, or it took you by surprise. The final one, there is some objective cause of that experience. This feature is noetic quality or noeticism. This is the idea of gaining some new special wisdom or information or knowledge that comes from having the experience. Now we bring back the script. How does Russell contrast seeing God with a clock in the room? If there's a crowd in a room and there's a clock in a room, they can all see the clock. Well, what Russell explains here is that religious experiences are private, and unlike all seeing a clock in a room, everybody in the room seeing the clock, not all of the people will experience God. And so here he's making his first claim, his first criticism of religious experience, and he's saying that they are purely subjective in nature. Because religious experiences, according to Russell, are purely private and they happen to the individual. And unlike everyone in a room that sees the clock and experiences it, that doesn't happen to people that have religious experiences. Now, we also see that Copleston, in his response, says, I remember Julian Huxley in some lecture saying that religious experience or mystical experience is as much a real experience as falling in love or appreciating poetry and art. So, Copleston refers to Julian Huxley. And this is really interesting because Julian Huxley is a British evolutionary biologist who compared religious experience with falling in love. How does that respond to Russell's private experience argument? Well, religious experiences are everywhere and they happen to everyone. Huxley's example of falling in love assumes there really is a person to fall in love with. Therefore, religious experiences suggest a real God who can be encountered. This is Copleston arguing that religious experiences are objective, not subjective, because they actually mean something. Now, why is Copleston avoiding famous Christian religious experiences? He's a Catholic priest, for example. Why is he ignoring the multitude of mystics out there that you've even studied, such as Saint Bernadette or Julian of Norwich? Well, he avoids famous Christian people that have had religious experiences because remember, he's not arguing from revelation, he's arguing from reason. Is Russell right to say that religious experiences are always private? Probably not. And so what we've got here is Copleston avoiding famous Christian religious experiences. He uses someone who actually was famous for starting the humanist organization, which is very clever. But we've got Russell, who also doesn't actually have a full grasp of religious experiences, because he obviously didn't know about the Azusa Street revival going back in the early 1900s, 1901, I believe, when in Los Angeles, there was a famous revival that took place where hundreds and hundreds of people converted to Christianity because of religious experiences, all happening at the same time. Or in modern day, which obviously he wouldn't be aware of because he passed away before it happened. But we could use the Toronto blessing, and we could use that in the 1990s up to the present day to show that actually there are corporal experiences, people that have experiences together of God. So take a look at some corporate experiences of religious experience.
It began January 20th, 1994.
You couldn't walk straight. People don't know what to do.
Some called it unusual.
Just get so full that they're just, wow.
It carried her home.
Others called it interesting.
Their lives are totally transformed.
You lived through it.
It was unprecedented. And because of it, hundreds of thousands of people drew to a city, a church, to experience the Toronto blessing.
I want to read from Luke chapter 1. Some of you think that I don't give readings.
They think Toronto's something. Wait till they come to Boston.
It's oh God.
And you get the gist. And so you can see how it ruins Russell's clock argument and his analogy of the clock in the room, because it seems that actually religious experiences can be involving more than one person, and it's not always private. I'll take you back to the interesting fact as well about Julian Huxley. Just to be clear, he was the grandson of Darwin, the close friend of Darwin, and he helped form the British Humanist Association. So it's likely that Copleston was reinterpreting his words to suit his argument, by the way. But clever nonetheless, because it avoids using people that rely on revelation, and he was able to use somebody who was considered reasonable by Russell. Now, Russell starts comparing religious experiences to Japanese people having intense relationships with fictional characters in novels. And it all gets a little bit weird, and no one quite knows how Russell is able to do this. But have a little look of this clip that shows a man who marries a video game character. It's known as otaku in Japanese culture for those obsessive about anime and manga characters.
While many people love playing their video games, one college student going by the name of Sal 9000 has chosen to express his love by getting married to Nene Anagasaki, a character from his favorite video game. Sal 9000 says that although he doesn't want to represent all otaku, a breed of Japanese obsessed with games, computers, and their own fantasy worlds, he does admit that the idea stemmed partly from how he and others refer to game characters.
In the Japanese otaku or nerd culture, there's a tradition of calling characters my wife. And I sort of thought of Nene as my wife. Since I was calling her that, I thought we'd just have to get married then.
In addition to the 40 attendees, over 3,000 people watched Sal 9000 and Nene taking their vows as it was broadcast live on the popular Japanese video site Nico Nico Doga. As the game has voice recognition, it's possible to have a conversation, or even play rock, paper, scissors with the characters in the game, and Sal 9000 is vowed to have and to hold, for better and for worse, even if an upgraded version is released.
So Russell makes this very strange connection, it seems here, with Japanese authors who measure success on how many readers fall in love with imaginary characters or commit suicide even because of them. To argue you can fall in love with somebody imaginary. And that's how Russell uses this to respond to Copleston's previous argument, that we fall in love with somebody rather than nobody. And it's what he says here when we have a little look at the language that's used. He says, may I interrupt for a moment? Japanese novelists never consider that they've achieved success since large numbers of real people commit suicide for love of the imaginary heroine. I mean, Copleston says, well, I must take your word for these goings on in Japan. I haven't committed suicide, I'm glad to say, but I've been strongly influenced in the taking of two important steps. I mean, it is an odd thing suddenly that they start talking about. We don't really know how Russell comes to know about these Japanese things that have been taking place. We know more about it today because of social media and the news. But nevertheless, what Russell does is he tries to debunk Copleston's point from using Huxley, that we just fall in love with somebody rather than nobody. And he says that, well, you can fall in love with anything, it seems, and it's still not real always. So what Copleston does is he moves away from what he doesn't really know about. He's a bit perplexed by Russell's use of this Japanese idea. And he brings in some ideas which are far more familiar to him, as his background would expect. It's likely that one of Copleston's influential biographies was of Saint Francis of Assisi. And we know this because he converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism at the age of 18. And he also goes on to mention Saint Francis of Assisi a little bit later on, because he says here, I've been influenced in the taking of two important steps in my life by two biographies. So we're going to assume that one of them is definitely St. Francis of Assisi because he mentions him here. Now, what's the distinction that Copleston makes in response to Russell's imaginary character argument? Well, Copleston argues that there is a clear difference between a mystical experience of God and appreciating a fictional character. Some are deluded and simply cannot tell the difference. We can find this here when he says a subjectivist explanation is possible in the case of certain people in whom there is little relation between the experience and life, and in the case of deluded people and hallucinated people, and so on. And so he says that there is a distinction between the people that have mystical experiences of God that are real and those that just appreciate fictional characters. Some people are just deluded, they don't really tell the difference at all. And he mentions St. Francis of Assisi. What does Copleston say is the outcome of a life like St. Francis? And how does this link perhaps to year 12 knowledge of someone like F.R. Happold? How is this different to the outcome of Russell's use of the Japanese example? Well, St. Francis had, Copleston says, an experience that results in, here it is, you get an experience that results in an overflow of dynamic and creative love. That's his explanation of St. Francis' experience. Now, this is very similar to Happold, who defines mystical experiences beyond William James and talks about the mysticism of love and union. Religious experience leads, in other words, to a positive lifestyle, and this is what Copleston wants to argue. It's how he tries to argue that it's an objective thing, not just a subjective idea. The Japanese example that Russell uses ends with delusion, or even, as Russell pointed out, suicide. The former delusion, that Copleston refers to, such as the mystical love and union of a religious experience, is objective, and the latter is subjective, because it's delusional. That's what Copleston is saying is different. Now, what is Russell quick to remind Copleston about here? He's quick to remind him that he is agnostic and that he isn't dogmatic. I think he preempted, possibly, Copleston about to accuse him of being dogmatic again. He says, well, I'm not contending in a dogmatic way. He's really quick to point that out. He gets it in there. Now, Russell argues, not all mystics are like St. Francis. Some refer to demons and devils, and we can see this right at the bottom. If his vision is true, very, very difficult, it may be said to know that there are devils, but I don't know that there are. Russell argues that some refer to demons and devils, these mystics of the past. And if one accepts mystical experiences of St. Francis as encountering an objective reality, then the same must be also said of those that argue that there are demons and devils that are real. Now here, Russell assumes that belief in the demonic would simply discredit belief in God. And that's a question that is for us to agree or disagree on. If we're religious, like Copleston, and we believe that there is a God, most would then argue that there has to be opposites, and therefore there would be demons and devils that exist. If there's good, there is evil. But not all do. And so Russell makes the assumption that it would be completely unintelligible to argue that there are demons and devils that exist. And so he tries to trap Copleston into accepting what seems to be silly. So Russell and Copleston discuss, as they would now go on to do, demonic religious experiences. Russell claims that you can't judge a religious experience to be true just because of the effect that they have on someone's behavior, which is the argument Copleston was just making. Now, why does Copleston believe that demonic experiences don't count as evidence here? Well, this is because what he says is, in the case of the devils, there have been people speaking mainly of visions. Remember earlier, we said that visions can be easily compared with hallucinations and delusions. So Copleston immediately agrees with Russell and says, yeah, these people that have talked about demons and devils, they are having visions, and actually these can be delusional and hallucinatory. Now, what does Russell believe demonic experiences are? We can see what he really thinks about them here. Takes quite a Freudian view. He says, I'm talking of a purely mental experience. He effectively argues that they are purely mental, they're neurotic. Now, what is the distinction that Copleston makes between a demonic and a mystical experience of God? He needs to make this distinction because if he now agrees with Russell that demonic experiences don't count as evidence, he then ends up alienating his previous view that you can take mystical experiences in an objective fashion. Well, the difference that Copleston makes between demonic and mystical experiences is the effect it has on a person's life. He says here, I do not think that people who have claimed to have experienced Satan in the precise way in which mystics claim to have experienced God is the same. And he goes on to use this example, and it's the example he gives of Plotinus here, in order to show the distinction and to argue that it's about the effect it has on a person's life. Now, Copleston introduces Plotinus, the 3rd century Greek pagan mystic, and his views influenced Christians and Muslims. Despite being a pagan, he believed in one God and devoted himself to mystical experiences. Now, what does Copleston say about the effect that mystical experiences would have on Plotinus? Well, it says here that they give him general kindness. And there it is, general kindness and benevolence. The account of Plotinus's general kindness and benevolence. And this is his example that he uses. Now, it was actually Porphyry who recorded everything that we know about Plotinus, as a side note. And Russell gives a really good rebuttal to Copleston's use of Plotinus here. What is it? Well, he says, the fact that a belief has a good moral effect upon a man is no evidence whatsoever in favor of its truth. Just because it has an effect upon someone, it doesn't mean that what was behind it was actually real or true. Now, what are the two ways that Copleston then attempts to argue against Russell's great rebuttal? Copleston's two ways are, number one, he says the belief was responsible for a good effect. The belief was actually responsible for a good effect on the man's life. For an example, belief in an omnibenevolent God, an all-loving God, might cause someone to love other people more. If I believe God is all-loving, I may then want to give that love away or emulate that love to other people. The second thing he says is using the character. He said, I am using the character of the life as evidence in favor of the mystic's veracity and sanity, rather than as a proof of the truths of his beliefs. In other words, moral life is evidence that they are sane, that they are truthful, and therefore one should trust their experience more, because there is evidence based on the way that they now live, the fact that they must be mentally fine and they must be telling the truth here. Now, how does Russell use his own experiences to refute Copleston's point even further? It says that Russell's own inspirational experiences have led to good moral decisions, but they didn't come from outside of him. Let's see where he says that. Those experiences that were good and moral in character were important, but they did not involve the existence of something outside of me. Very interesting point. Would the good effect be evidence that the experience was from God? Russell is winning in the argument here, it seems. Copleston is struggling to explain, firstly, how a pure type of mystical experience is different from a demonic one where people are delusional. Then he struggles then to explain how good effects of a belief system are evidence to trust the belief is true. Because Russell points out very happily that there are good things that he does, but they're not necessarily based on something that has come from outside of him. So what false beliefs still have a good effect? Think about these things. Man believes his wife is faithful and feels lucky to be married to her, but really she's cheating on him. What is this called, and how does it relate? These capsules are fabulous. When I look at the box, I stop coughing. Well, this is called the placebo effect in psychology. False beliefs can lead to good effects. What true beliefs are there that might have terrible effects? Man who believes his wife is cheating on him is driven to depression. You see, beliefs that are false can lead to goodness. Beliefs that are true can lead to terrible effects. So it doesn't really matter. Maybe Russell is winning in the argument here. So they now move on to discuss how people can be positively influenced by characters in books who don't really exist. Russell introduces Lycurgus, 900 BCE, ancient Greek legend, organized Sparta into a militaristic society, it's believed. So the question here is, how does Russell use Lycurgus to raise the placebo effect even further? Well, Russell imagines how a schoolboy might read about Lycurgus and be really inspired by his story, perhaps to get involved in politics, or to join the army, or to visit Greece, or to get grades in Latin, or simply to be a better person. If the schoolboy found out about Lycurgus from reading Latin lessons, he would think Lycurgus was a real person who lived centuries ago. He'd be so enwrapped and enveloped in the story and the narrative. But in fact, Lycurgus is just a legend. But the boy at school has enjoyed a beneficial effect because he believed Lycurgus was real. And this is a little bit like the placebo effect, but instead with role models instead of medicines. We can pick out the key points in what he says here. The character of a young man is affected for good by reading about some great man in history, but actually the great man is a myth, he doesn't really exist, but the boy is much affected for good as if he did. And this is the placebo effect that Russell is referring to here. I mean, what does this actually all tell us about Russell and Copleston's backgrounds? It tells us that they think it's completely normal to be inspired by Latin lessons. Russell was an upper-class educator. He was upper-class educated at home by private tutors in his childhood. Copleston went to a boarding school, and most people in those days that were perhaps from what we might consider more normal backgrounds were inspired by people like Robin Hood. They certainly weren't talking about Lycurgus. So it gives you a little insight into perhaps the sort of backgrounds that they had. Now, how does Russell's use of Lycurgus link here to God? Well, God is like Lycurgus. Russell says you read about him. You could take the Quran, you could take the Bible, you could say you read about God in these scriptures, these holy books. You believe him to be real, inspired, positive effects then happen because of your inspiration from the text. But in the end, he may not be real. And this is what Russell is saying about God. Now, Copleston agrees with Russell, but what does he say is the distinction between a boy encountering a fictional character like Lycurgus and the mystic? Well, he says this, and you can highlight it. The mystic is encountering the ultimate reality. But the boy reading Lycurgus isn't. What has this all got to do with Russell's point? Well, you can take things like Jediism from Star Wars. Look at how that fictional storyline has led to a real kind of following of a religion that's been created called Jediism. It's a really postmodern thing, postmodern idea, and that links to your A2 work a little bit. And so we come to an end with the final paragraph here. They conclude this section discussing the extent to which loving God is like loving a phantom. And yet he's loving a phantom. You can see that there. So we start off by asking simply, what is a phantom? Well, a phantom is a ghost or an illusion. So loving God, is it the same as loving some kind of ghost or illusion? What kind of experience is the phantom according to Russell? Well, according to Russell, the ghost or the illusion, the phantom, is a subjective one. It's simply up here in the head. It's fiction. How does Copleston argue the real value of the love of a fictional character? And he says that here, he perceives a real value. How does he argue the real value of the love of a fictional character? He says that we don't just love any fictional character. So he's going back to the use of Russell's analogy of the boy and Lycurgus. He says there has to be something of value that we love. There has to be some objective value that they represent. What does he say those objective values might be? Things like, for example, compassion. Things like courage. He's saying that the character is fictional, but the values that they represent are real. And so for Russell, religious experiences are subjective and all up here, and for Copleston, there is some real objective value that comes from them. And they end by simply agreeing to disagree.